Hello, everyone, and welcome to Talk Nerdy. Today is Monday, October 7th, 2024, and I'm the host of the show, Cara Santa Maria. And as always, I do want to start off by thanking those of you who make Talk Nerdy possible. The show's been on air for 10 years, and the way that we keep doing that is by relying on support of individual listeners just like you. If you're interested in pledging your support on an episodic basis, which I think may be switching to monthly soon, I've still got to dig into that, and I will be giving updates on that when I have them. But if you do want to pledge your support, all you've got to do is visit patreon.com, that's patreon.com/talknerdy. And I usually read out the names of the folks in the highest pledge tier to say thank you. But I think this week I'm going to go through the names of those who have the sort of the lifetime records for the show. So this week I want to thank David J.E. Smith, Brian Holden, Daniel Lang, Gabrielle F. Jaramillo, Jeffrey Sewell, David Compton, Chuck Bleal, Juan Navarro, Charles Payette, Juan Gutierrez, Pasquale Gelati, Howard, Ulrika Hagman, Doug Pettipier, Joe Wilkinson, Mary Neva, Jacob Rochester, Wolf Witt, and Nitasar, Christian Jeffrey, Dave Martin, Nick Hilton, Lonnie Callison. Gosh, there's so many of you. You're amazing. And yeah, too many more for me to list. So thank you so much from the bottom of my heart. You keep this thing going, and I'm just so incredibly grateful. All right, let's get into it. So this week, I had the opportunity to speak with Dr. Sunil Amrith. Sunil is a professor. He's a historian, a professor of history at Yale, and he has a secondary appointment as professor at the Yale School of the Environment. He teaches, he writes, he's got like 5 books, and he's won a bunch of incredible prizes, including a MacArthur Fellowship, and just a really interesting and rich life. Born in Nairobi, grew up in Singapore, studied in England, and is now, of course, in Connecticut, teaching at Yale and doing his research there as well. And he has a new book out. It's called The Burning Earth, A History. So without any further ado, here he is, Dr. Sunil Amrith. Well, Sunil, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thanks for having me.
So I'm excited to talk about your new book, The Burning Earth, A History. But as always, when I talk to interesting people with interesting scholarship, before we get into kind of their newest work, I love to dive a little bit into your past and understand, you know, the areas throughout your career that you have explored and sort of how you got to where you are. So it's so funny because I literally just interviewed a history professor earlier in the day about her book, and it's wildly different. It's all about sex and sexuality. So it's like, history is fascinating because it's everything. You are a history professor, but also a professor at the Yale School of the Environment. So tell me a little bit about what you studied to get to that level of scholarship. What was like your undergrad in?
My undergrad was in history, and I did my undergrad in the UK, which is quite a different approach to undergraduate education. You're much more narrowly specialized in a single subject. So I went to university to study history. I already knew that's what I wanted to do. With retrospect, I wish I'd been able to do more things. It felt like quite a narrowing to such an extent that I think ever since then, I have been teaching myself to move beyond the discipline of history. And a lot of the work I've done has really been at the interface between history and many other fields, actually public health earlier in my career, environmental science and environmental policy in more recent work.
So I've heard this before, that the model in the UK is that by the time you get to your bachelor's degree, you've already kind of made the decision and you've sort of been guided in a certain direction. Do you find that, and because that is different than the US, but what's not different than the US is the sort of compartmentalization and the way that we categorize scholarship. I do think we're seeing more of a change here in multidisciplinary studies and more opportunities for kind of dipping your toe in different traditions. Do you find that that's changing in the UK as well? Or maybe it's been so long since you've been, but I'm just curious if that is a distinct difference between our academic models.
I'm sure things are changing in the UK. I mean, it's been almost a decade since I left there, so I'm not immediately in touch with things, but I do feel like the structure of the system is such that that shift, which I agree with you, is starting to happen, and we need a lot more of it. A shift towards more interdisciplinary approaches to problems. I think the US system is more open to accommodating those kinds of shifts than the British system, which is still you study one single subject throughout your undergrad.
Mm-hmm. And then, how did you, as you transitioned to graduate scholarship, tell me a little bit more about how you sort of maybe landed on what you wanted to study, where you focused your dissertation, and if that is kind of how would I put this? If it was a steady growth to where you are today, or if you sort of shifted gears.
I think there have been many twists in the road. I think by the time I finished my undergrad, I was just so excited by what I was studying, particularly what I was studying in the fields of Asian history and African history. This was in the late 1990s when those fields were really flourishing. There were new approaches coming out, new levels of emphasis on the perspectives of local people. And I felt very, very excited by that. I didn't immediately know I wanted to do a PhD in history, but I think that the deeper I delved into the subject, the more I found that history suited me precisely because it's such a broad umbrella. As you said at the beginning, history is everything from history of sexuality to the history of the environment to political history. And I felt that it was a discipline that would actually allow me to start delving into lots of different fields. And partly because I was very interested in these questions of inequality, poverty, development. This was in the early 2000s. I ended up doing my PhD on the history of public health and disease eradication in Asia in the middle of the 20th century. Strangely enough, I come back to that in The Burning Earth. There is actually quite a bit in the book about public health and questions like that. I didn't quite intend that, but that's the first sort of path I took. And that led me to think about the ambitions to massively reduce the burden of diseases like malaria in the global south in the 1940s and 50s, but also some of the difficulties that project ran into. And some of these are very familiar. And this was a pretty much a top-down set of health campaigns, which often didn't consult local people, which often imposed solutions on people. And I think that as a fundamental problem is something I've continued to be interested in throughout my career.
So I'm curious about your focus on this area of the world. Did you choose to kind of focus there because of your own like personal or familial history? Did you choose to focus there because it had maybe I don't want to say undue, but it had like a strong influence on policy across the globe? Like what brought you to that area of interest?
I'd say it's probably a combination of both of those things. So I did grow up in Singapore to Indian immigrant parents, and I had an upbringing where I was very aware of just how deeply interconnected that part of the world is, a world of many diasporas and a lot of migration. Um, but it also struck me as I became interested in a more academic sense in these massive problems of social inequality and health inequality in the middle of the 20th century that Asia was really, first of all, where some of those inequalities were most pronounced, but second of all, it was something like a testing ground for what became global policies, global health policies as we now think of them.
Mhm, mhm. Is that because of the of how certain infections or certain kind of public health issues are emergent there? Is it because there are so many different diasporas and so many people living closely together? Like, why do you think that is the testing or had kind of at that time become like the testing ground?
I think some of it is political. I think some of it has to do with decolonization as it was unfolding in that part of the world at that time. And what you see is that newly independent countries like India and Indonesia, very large countries, countries with high levels of inequality, um, when they gained their political freedom, I think there was a very strong sense that the exploitation of colonialism had really left them in a very difficult position. Um, Average life expectancy in India at the time of Indian independence was just about 30 years. It was already more than double that in Europe. So we're talking about this existential inequality. And I think there was a real sense of needing to move as quickly as possible to make up for what the leaders at the time felt was lost ground.
And do you think that that continues, that tradition continues today?
I do. And if we think about environmental politics, if we think about public health, I do think there is still a very strong sense in the global south of being in a hurry, being in a hurry to make up for enormous accumulated inequalities. And I think we see that, and we think we need to bear that in mind when we try to understand some of the decisions that have been taken over the last 50 or 60 years, including decisions that we can now see might have, in fact, deepened social exclusion for certain communities and strengthened the hand of a very top down approach to policy.
Absolutely. And I think in some ways this kind of does transition us. I mean, not really transition because we're already there, but back to this new work, which I mean, it's quite a tall order to tell the story of sort of human history as it relates to the planet, how we have shaped and been shaped by our global environment and all of the sort of geopolitical and important, I think, very kind of like humanistic concerns that feed into that. But one that kind of comes to mind just based on what we were just talking about and based on that sense of being in a hurry is the narrative that we're often grappling with now. And this is me saying we in the West, unfortunately, that we had all this time to extract and to pillage and to build and to with impunity and build empires and utilize the natural resources that we found at our fingertips. And now we see the inordinate repercussions of those actions, and we turn to places where they are in a hurry, and we say, "No, no, you can't do what we did. That's not okay. You got to figure out a better way." I mean, we can't figure out a better way, and we're not going to model it for you, but like you got to figure it out because ugh, we mess things up.
You know, Kara, the first person to really articulate this on the global stage was the Indian Prime Minister Indira Gandhi in the early 70s. Interestingly enough, despite I think, the misperception that countries of the global south are not that concerned with environmental questions, she was the only head of state to attend the first ever UN conference on the environment in 1972. It was her and the host, the Swedish leader Olof Palme. And this was back in 1972. She sets this out. She sets this out so articulately, so clearly. And in a way, we're still grappling with the implications of what she said. And what she said is exactly that. She's like, you've had 200-300 years to extract and extract and extract. And now you're turning to us and telling us we can't do the same. And what was, I think, morally powerful about her statement was she said, and I agree, we care about these environmental destruction as well, but what do you expect us to do? And she sets out the challenge that she saw before her, which was to, cater for the basic needs of a fifth of humanity in one generation.
Yeah, that's a big challenge. And that is it's I think it's even hard when talking about these issues. I'm coming at it from I'm this podcaster who has you now on my show and I don't peel back the curtain a little bit and you're probably well aware and I'm sure all of my listeners who have been listening for years are well aware. I don't really like write questions in advance and I don't really think about an arc to the interviews. I just want to talk and I want to see what comes up and I want to follow the threads that feel relevant and that co-create in this hour that we have together. And I think the thing that keeps coming up for me is wow, when you're writing about these topics and when you're researching this in an in-depth way and you're grappling with how you're going to communicate these e- these existential threats, how do you do it in such a way that is not like the most cynical and depressed? And I mean, how do you write a whole book about this without wanting to just end it?
Kara, I think that touches on one of the questions that I get quite a lot, and this is even from people who've read either early versions of the book or who've started to read it now, and that is, is it a bleak book? And there's no question that it documents an enormous amount of human suffering, and indeed, for that matter, animal suffering. And while writing it, there were times when I felt sad. There were times when I felt very angry at the injustices that I was researching and documenting and writing about. But in the end, I think I felt very hopeful. And the reason I felt hopeful by the time I'd finished writing The Burning Earth is because of the dozens of examples in the book of people who have fought back, who have resisted that path of destruction. And this goes back to 17th century England, and there are these amazing stories of villagers in the fenlands fighting against this massive project to drain their wetlands and to deprive them of the ecosystems that were so culturally as well as economically important to their lives. And of course, as we get into the 20th century, the last quarter of The Burning Earth is really about the rise of the environmental movement. And there are so many inspiring examples of people really taking a stand and offering a more hopeful vision of how we can inhabit this planet. I end in the epilogue with this amazing protest movement led by women in Indonesia in East Nusa Tenggara in the mid 2000s. And what they're protesting is they're protesting a marble mine that is not only causing environmental destruction, but also, as they saw it, desecration of the local environment, submontane forests that they held to be spiritually important. And these women were armed with nothing more than hand looms. And reading about their protests, which in this case was successful, that the mine went packing, I was struck by the resonance of it, the layers of it. It's echoing Mahatma Gandhi's protests against British colonialism. There's this whole vocabulary of activists sharing ideas across borders. And for me, that is why The Burning Earth is not in the End of Bleak book. It's actually, I think, and I hope, a hopeful book.
You know, I can't help but draw a parallel, and this is me hijacking this conversation for a second. As the host of the show, I reserve the right. But yeah, I think about that question that you're posed with that I just posed to you. Like, how do you do this? And how do you maintain? And it's funny because in my own life, I work as a psychologist in a cancer center, and I do a lot of focus on end of life. And people tell me all the time, like, how do you do that job? Like, you must be so depressed all the time. And like, it's always like really confusing to me when people ask me that because I'm in no way depressed all the time. And having the exposure and the privilege and the honor of being close to people when they're nearing the end of their life reminds me that I'm alive. And having that gift from them is like the greatest gift. And I think that these stories remind us that we're on this planet right now and that we have so much power, technology, and wisdom. We just need the political will to make these changes.
That's beautifully put, Cara. I think that is very powerfully the sense that I had. And it did feel like a privilege to write these stories, to write about the enormous courage, the enormous sacrifices that people around the world have made, to insist on a vision that I think so many of the readers of The Burning Earth will share, that the way we're currently treating this planet that we share is insane, and that we need to find better ways. And I think there have been so many instances of these positive, hopeful visions, many of which are joyful visions. This is not just about protest in a negative sense, but this is often about celebration. This is about celebrating the interdependence and indeed the kinship that we have with the rest of nature. But just building on what you just said about your own work, Cara, we read a lot about ecological anxiety. And this is something that I'm very sensitive to. We're inundated with depressing statistics about the global environment. And I think what led me to write The Burning Earth was really becoming a parent myself. I have two kids under the age of 11, and they're acutely concerned with the environment and with our future. And it was making that connection between sort of bedtime conversations with my kids and the research that I've been doing for 20 years that brought about the book in the form that it now exists. And some of this builds on 2 decades of archival work, fieldwork that I've done myself, but some of it is stepping back from that and asking the biggest questions, like how does this keep happening?
And how, I'm always curious, and I never know if it's annoying or not when I get into this with authors, but how did you decide the structure? How did you decide how you're going to tell these stories? And, what are the bookends here? And this is too big a topic, right? So how do you choose how to constrain yourself to be able to tell this in an effective way?
I found the size of the topic in some ways was liberating because it this can only ever be a personal take on the subject. I was not trying to write something encyclopedic, and there's literally no way I could have covered everything. And so my guiding principle was really to focus in on these moments of change, these moments of transition, um, strung together like on a chain in a way that helps me tell the story as I see it. And the way I see it is that really one thing in particular holds together the escalating harm that we have done to this planet, and that is the violent pursuit of inequality through empire. That's the through line in The Burning Earth, and that helped me um, shape the book so that I'm focusing on these moments where that interrelationship between human suffering and environmental harm escalates in a whole series of steps. And not in a linear way, but always with pushback, always with challenges.
To that point, it's interesting because obviously there is a growing consciousness about environmental justice. There are whole fields of academic inquiry that are focusing on this. There are nonprofit organizations. There are people who I think identify their own kind of personalities or their own, interests in this area. But I also notice that the more kind of mainstream conversations about climate change, about global warming, about extractive practices. See, they don't even use the term extractive practices, but like that these conversations very often don't bring environmental justice into the picture. That somehow they feel still quite divorced from the human beings who are affected by the planet. Do you notice that as well?
I do notice that. And if there is one message in The Burning Earth, I think that message is that the case for environmental justice is overwhelming and it is urgent. And I do want to see that put front and center in so many of our conversations, whether that's in the upcoming COP or on the fringes of that in terms of all of the conversations that we're having. There is a groundswell. There's a rising movement for environmental justice all around the world. You're absolutely right about that. And I hope that some of the longer history which I present in The Burning Earth might be able to nourish those conversations.
Do you think that some of the difficulty going to that place is because it's so existentially threatening? Or do you think that more of the share of the kind of historical ignoring of the social justice component of this is simply because many of the people in power are removed from the obvious outcomes because they've managed to buffer themselves. So the people who are the most vulnerable are often the people that are the farthest away from the decision makers.
I think that's exactly right. They're farthest away from decision makers. They're also farthest away from the root causes of the problems that we are all now sort of facing the effects of. And I suppose that's the existential basis of environmental injustice, which is that those who have done almost nothing, literally nothing, to cause the climate crisis are really at the front line of feeling its impact and have their voices least heard in the corridors of power. And I do think that the refusal to engage with the question of social environmental justice has to do with uncomfortable questions that then raises about the nature of privilege in the world today and the fact that often it has been built on environmental theft and vandalism.
Yeah. Yeah. It's kind of like when the person who does something super racist is called racist and they're like, "Wow, that was cruel of you to call me racist." I think that we do see this real defensiveness around responsibility and around ownership. And very often there is also a shift. We were talking about how the people who are most vulnerable are the farthest away from those corridors of power. But even within, let's say, a wealthy nation like the United States, the onus is put on the individual so often. And so it breeds this experience of like blame, shame, but also just like deep crippling guilt that sort of, oh, I can't solve this crisis myself because I'm not recycling correctly. And so because of that, I guess we're all doomed, as opposed to highlighting what actually is happening here.
I think that's so perceptive, Cara, that if taking a long historical view leads us to anything, it is to lead us, I think, away from this very individualized way of talking about the climate crisis. So many of us want to do more in our everyday lives, and of course, we can and we should do that. But I think it's not an accident that the very idea of each of our personal carbon footprints was initially come up with by the oil industry, because
Right.
it was a way to divert attention from regulatory change, from legal change, from systemic change, and putting it on each of us.
And we carry it, very heavily. But what's the motivation there? Is it really as simple? I mean, it probably is, but is it really as simple as just like corporate greed? Like it's just money, right? It just comes down to money.
It does come down to money, but I think there's also complications there. So I remember back in 2016, The Guardian did a very interesting investigation suggesting that 80% or around 80% of cumulative carbon emissions ever can be attributed to 20 companies.
What? Oh my God.
What complicates that, though, is that more than half of those companies are not the ones that we might imagine, though they are certainly on that list too. A lot of them are state owned energy corporations in the global south, many of which were actually set up for socially and economically liberatory reasons. This is companies like Petrobras in Brazil, which was initially set up in the 1950s and 1960s to try to lift Brazilians out of poverty by using that energy wealth that they had and that they thought the oil is ours. That was the cry at the time. Of course, those promises were very often betrayed. It's not that mineral and energy wealth has necessarily been to the benefit of the poor in almost any part of the global south. But nevertheless, that's what makes it interesting that, yes, it's the big American oil corporations that we would expect are on that list, but there's also companies with rather different histories, some of which are state-owned, which were set up at least with a different set of aims in mind. And that's what I think makes it morally both complicated and interesting to think, is it greed? Is it need? How do those two things intersect? And I think in The Burning Earth, I really say it's both. And it's where the paths of need and greed come together that we can understand where we are. So, our biggest impact on the planet continues to be in pursuit of the two most ancient human needs, food and shelter. And agriculture accounts for more than a quarter of global greenhouse gas emissions. And yet we still live in a world of hunger. We still live in a world of malnutrition. We still live in a world of homelessness, even though construction industry, domestic construction alone accounts for a significant part of global emissions. So inequality is, I think, baked into that question of, is it need or is it greed?
Absolutely. And I think understanding that there is this sort of complex interplay between the two, it helps to, I mean, in my view at least, it helps to allow us to operate and have these conversations in the gray area instead of always demonizing the other side. Because I do, and it's not even a two-sided thing, but I do very often see that well-meaning and thoughtful communications um, around sort of planetary or climate justice often devolve into those are the bad guys and look at these poor good guys. And if only the bad guys would stop being bad, the poor good guys would be better off. But like, we have to live. There are too many of us and we need resources. And I think we often forget that if we just shut down carbon emissions like tomorrow, it would be not good.
It would
Like
be
people would suffer inordinately.
People would suffer inordinately, and I think I like the way you put it. The gray areas are where we need to be having the conversations. The gray areas are the areas which I was really trying to hone in on in the Burning Earth. And let's take an example. Let's think about air conditioning. Air conditioning is a profoundly environmentally harmful technology. And yet, are we going to say to the large numbers of people in the global south who can only now afford air conditioning units at a time when air conditioning units are becoming not just a matter of comfort, but indeed perhaps even of survival, as we're seeing more and more extremes of heat in places like North India? We're going to say, no, you can't have those technologies?
No, we can't say that.
Well, especially
I mean,
since 80%
because you
of
could die if you don't have it in certain parts of the
That's right.
world.
That's right. And of course, we need to make those technologies less harmful as quickly as we can. But I do think there are these really urgent moral dilemmas that cannot be solved with simple answers.
Mhm. Mhm. And it's it reminds me of an experience I had on this very show several years ago when I interviewed somebody who was involved in the conservation hunting movement in parts of southern Africa. And I, before I went to Namibia, before I visited these areas where animals were being tagged, where tags were being sold, where those hunts were happening, and then the sold tag was going to fund anti-poaching patrol. I didn't get it. It was very easy for me in the West to be like, but elephants, you're cruel, and like it's only a bad thing and there's nothing, it doesn't work that way. And I think very often we do such a disservice when in the West we pretend to understand a zeitgeist or a culture of a part of the world that we fundamentally do not understand, and we assume moral superiority. Do it like us. Trust me, it'll work.
Right. And I think that one of the outcomes of taking a global perspective, as I've tried to do in The Burning Earth, is there are no one size fits all answers. We have such different histories, we have such different starting points, such different baselines, that something that is politically and morally urgent in one part of the world may not work in another. And I think we really need to understand that as quickly as possible.
And this idea that this doesn't apply to me, or this idea that I can just continue on as I've continued on. I don't want to read a book like this. I don't want to watch a documentary about it. I don't want to be, confronted with it because then I get sad. Like, I guess the question that I have for you is why, obviously, like, I'm not asking this because I don't know, but why is it important that we are confronted with these things if we are privileged and lucky enough that we don't have to think about them if we don't want to?
For me, that's the hardest question of all, because I think an element of denial, and by denial, I don't mean the sort of large scale denial that the fossil fuel companies have been engaged with in terms of suppressing climate research, etc., but I mean the everyday denial that any one of us is inclined towards. I understand it, and I am also empathetic towards that wish to just get on with everyday life. And it can feel that these problems are so large and so overwhelming that there's nothing that any one of us can do. And I think the reason to confront it, the reason to read about it, the reason to read about it even when it's dark and difficult, is because this is our shared inheritance. This is not about guilt. This is actually about collective responsibility. I hope that readers of The Burning Earth are not going to read it and feel guilty about their actions or their choices, but rather feel a sense of shared purpose. The fact that this is the outcome of human choices and decisions in the past, many of which have turned out very, very differently from how those who made them at the time thought they would. And I think that gives us a sense that our choices matter. And I think more than anything else, that's why I believe it is important and urgent to engage and confront.
I can't help but see a parallel. I'm going to make an American parallel here with the movement to sort of whitewash academic textbooks, especially in the younger years, and remove things like, quote, critical race theory, and remove conversations out of fear that we're making the descendants of slave owners feel guilty, as opposed to like, these systems are perpetuated, and if we don't know about them, we keep reintroducing them, and we keep propping them up, and it's not about guilt, it's about responsibility, and I think those are two very different things.
They are, and I think that's beautifully put, Cara. It's the same conversation, really. I mean, in some sense, we're dealing with the darkest moments in human history over the last 500 years have also, not by accident, been the moments of the most intensive planetary environmental destruction. And in The Burning Earth, we go back to the work of enslaved people on the plantations, and sugar plantations, and we go to global warfare and its inordinate impact on the environment while inflicting such suffering on people. So I think it's the same question. It's no, we can't talk about that. It's too depressing or it'll make us feel guilty. But I don't think that's the aim. I think the aim is to think, well, how can we correct some of these injustices and how can we take a greater sense of responsibility? I mean, I was struck. There was a review of The Burning Earth in the Financial Times in London, which is, of course, a newspaper which is targeted primarily at the financial elite. And didn't come as a big surprise they didn't like The Burning Earth. But what was interesting was they presented it as simply a catalogue of horrors. One
Oh,
thing is
gee.
better than another, without at any moment sort of tying those threads together by talking about social justice, by talking about environmental justice, by talking about empire. And it was very much the argument, this is just too depressing. And it's human nature that's causing all of this. Well, you're a psychologist, Cara, and I'm careful in the Burning Earth not to talk about human nature, because I think there are many ways of being human. And I think the social arrangements and the political arrangements and the collective values that different societies have formulated have very different implications for how we live together on this planet.
Yeah, not only am I a psychologist, I'm an existential psychologist who is very atheistically oriented, and I think about this phrase that you see a lot in existential psychology or just in existential philosophy, really. And I know I read about it in a speech by Jean-Paul Sartre, but I don't know if he's the first to come up with it. But this idea that existence precedes essence. We are first thrown into existence, and then we choose how to be. It's not the other way around. And
I love that. Absolutely.
right? And this concept that we are doomed to keep going, it shows the same fundamental flaw that I see often in psychotherapeutic practice, where, we almost have this mantra that like first comes insight, then comes action. You cannot change if you are unaware of where you're getting stuck and why you're getting stuck. And you can't give someone insight. I wish you could. I do. My job wouldn't my job would be so much easier.
Yeah, it'd be easier if one could.
But
Yeah.
we have to excavate those things for ourselves, and we have to be exposed to the deep history and the stories, because without that context, it's like teaching science that way too, and we see this fail time and time again. This is how things are because we said so, instead of this is how things are because look how we discovered that.
And to
And these
encourage in readers, including young people, a sense of discovering for themselves on the basis of whatever information we can present in different fields, to really discover for themselves.
And so how did you choose those stories? Like you mentioned that it's sort of this personal thread, and kind of coming back to yourself and your engagement was how you could string together these sort of temporal examples to tell this story. But where did you come to find those very human stories? What was salient to you? And kind of how did you choose them?
That was really the journey of discovery that was most joyful in writing The Burning Earth, was the research, really. It was delving into the global history of environmental protests, for example. I came across each of these case studies over the years, some of it in my own research and some of it in teaching. I've been teaching environmental history for 15 or 20 years now. And some of these are examples that maybe students had mentioned in class. Some of these are examples that I'd read about or had heard about in conversation. And what I loved was the sort of sense of interconnectedness and links. So I'd be talking to an environmentalist in India and they would say, oh, there's this amazing movement going on in Latin America that had inspired them. And so this is a global story in a positive sense as well. This is a global story of how ideas travel, of how positive approaches to environmental protection travel. And so bit by bit, I mean, I've been, in some sense, people have asked me how long the Burning Earth took. I mean, the sort of immediate answer is 5 or 6 years, but the real answer is about 20 years because I've been accumulating these examples throughout my academic career. And at some point, it really was a question of laying them out almost on the floor of my writing room and just sort of compositing them together in the form that helped me, I think, tell the story in what I hoped was the most powerful way possible.
And kind of on that point of this sort of feedback mechanism over these past, as you said, like maybe the 4 or 5 years of taking all of that knowledge and taking all of that insight and really trying to organize it into a narrative, did that then in sort of did that then ultimately affect how you teach? And could the Burning Earth, a history, in some ways be a backbone to how you tell these stories in your classroom?
Cara, I actually tried this in the spring semester before the book was out.
Oh,
I
really?
taught it, yes, I taught it as a lecture class at Yale for undergraduates. They hadn't seen the book, and the book, I was still in the final stages of copy editing and everything else, but I used it as the basis for a lecture class.
Oh, I love that. Because yeah, it's a culmination of your work in so many ways.
That was a wonderful experience, not just because the students engage in such wonderful ways, but it was also a lesson to me. I don't think the students found it depressing. I think they found it challenging. I think they found it uncomfortable at times, but that was not a piece of feedback that I received, that this class was a depressing class. And that gives me more hope than anything else in terms of how readers, and maybe especially younger readers, will use the Burning Earth as the basis for conversations.
It's also, I think, an interesting question about the way that we write, and that historically we had this, and we still do. I mean, I just think it's starting to overlap a little bit. But historically, there was a very firm distinction between academic writing, journal articles, what we call sort of academic presses, and then trade publications, right? Things that are written for a broader audience, things that are written for a more general audience. And while I think there is still very much a place for technical writing and very much a place for sophisticated academic writing that uses shorthand language that simply would be too dense for somebody who didn't have the background to get into it, I'm loving seeing a shift more into talking about like core issues in an academic classroom using more trade writing approaches.
I agree. And I think what's really exciting is that we don't have to choose. I mean, I think each of us, I will continue to write academic journal articles that are maybe more oriented towards my immediate colleagues in a particular field. Um, I will continue to do work that is more at a kind of university press level. But it seems both an opportunity and a responsibility to use the academic work that we all do to be able to reach wider audiences, and indeed to trust those audiences and to credit those audiences with the curiosity that they do indeed have, and to be able to bring something of themselves to these books as well. And I think we can learn a lot from that. I think it's shifting. I don't think it's decisively shifted. I certainly find in my field there are still some academics who don't think we should be writing trade books, who think it's somehow diluting the content of the academic scholarship. I couldn't disagree more.
And I take it one step farther. Or further. Yes, I take it one step further, and I think that the skill that is used in writing to a trade audience should then be reintegrated into our academic teachings, because this is how we capture the imaginations of our students, and this is how students learn how to communicate with not just their immediate families and their communities, but new generations of students, and for those who are in a position to, testify before Congress, to have conversations with people outside of their fields that could really make an impact. I'm sorry, but an academic publication is not how you do it. Like the skills that you utilize when you do public communication and trade writing are just as relevant within academic walls as they are outside of them. And I'm like, I don't know why that's not the common narrative at this point.
And is your sense, Cara, that that's starting to shift in, say, science PhD programs? Is there more emphasis on science communication?
Slightly more, or maybe we should say it's just more accepted. I don't think that the script has flipped in that direction yet, but I do think that we're starting to see that change. But, you could go to any university campus and ask the students, like, what's your favorite class? And there's some cool professor who does a class on, like, the science of superheroes, and, like, all the kids are flocking to it, and they're learning a lot. And it's like, why do you think that class is so popular?
Right, because you can kind of, you engage with students where they are, or at least where they're starting.
Right.
You introduce them.
Right. And the thing is, even if you're an academic, you're still a person.
That's easy. When I was trained, Cara, that was, you were meant to forget that you were a person.
Right, that's true.
I mean, I did my PhD at the University of Cambridge in the early 2000s when it was a different time and it was a different place. And the idea was really, it was still these sort of bachelor scholars who were just devoted to their books, and you didn't talk about your life, you didn't talk about yourself, you didn't talk about why you care, why you do this work in the first place. I mean, I think those are the most important questions that whatever field we're in, we should all ask ourselves, I think.
Absolutely. I think that there's a reason that most of these graduate degrees are PhDs. Like they're you get I'm looking at mine on the wall. It's a doctor of philosophy in your field. And I think that we have gotten to be so specialized and so technical that we sometimes forget that the fundamental questions we're all grappling with are humanistic questions. And that's why all of this scholarship came to be in the first place. And I think that's something you cut to the core of in this book. Like, yes, it's a history book. Yes, you are talking about, these pretty complex and like we talked about, the gray area questions about social justice and environmental justice. That is a philosophy that sits on important questions about who we are, why we're here, and how we want to live our lives.
Exactly. I think that's what it comes down to, that most existential of philosophical questions. How should we live? And I think we can lose sight of that when we get into the weeds of very technical policy discussions about carbon credits or climate change financing. All absolutely vital questions, but I do think it's important always to remind ourselves of the deeper questions that underlie that, which is, what sort of future do we want on this planet?
And so, what are you hoping that readers of this book might walk away with? Maybe sometimes we talk about the big themes, and I hope that they get it. And maybe what we were just discussing is one of them. But then sometimes it's not about the big takeaways, and it's about like these little nuggets that sort of shift the way that we think. And so I'm curious if there's anything in it that you're like, oh, I hope people get that when they read it.
I think many readers might remember most from The Burning Earth some of the small stories and exchanges. For example, there's this amazing conversation that Mahatma Gandhi has with Charlie Chaplin. And I talk about that in one of the earlier chapters of the book, in which they're talking about basically what we now can describe as the problem of overconsumption. And Charlie Chaplin says to Mahatma Gandhi, you don't seem to think much of machinery. And Gandhi says, well, look at what it did to India in terms of British colonialism, and you might understand why. And Chaplin is mulling over this, and it feeds into him making the film Modern Times, which is a sort of satire of the dehumanizing impact of factory life at that point in the 1930s. And so there are all these moments where great thinkers and great artists and intellectuals are starting to engage with what we now see as our planetary crisis. And I think that may be something which readers will take away from them. The other thing I pay a lot of attention to is the arts. I mean, I do think that creative media are some of the most powerful ways in which all of us have engaged with what's happening to the planet, but also with positive visions of the future. So I end the epilogue with Miyazaki's film Princess Mononoke from the late 1990s, which I felt like this was a parable that in some ways encapsulated the story that I tell in The Burning Earth, that it was a story of destruction. It was the story of a war on nature, which couldn't possibly be won, but it also had a hopeful resolution and a sense that a more humble way of living on this earth might actually be to everyone's benefit, including the benefit of human flourishing.
Oh, I love that. And I have to ask this going back to your first example, the the Charlie Chaplin film, The Great Dictator, there's this like stunning speech in it. Do you think that that was inspired or kind of grew out of those conversations?
It might well have been. I
Because
mean,
those themes are just, yeah, they're just baked into it. It's all about, progress
yeah.
and technology, but not at the expense of our humanity.
And there are these two encounters that Chaplin has, which are very interesting. One is this meeting with Gandhi. The other is his trip to the Ford factory, where he's learning that more and more the workers, because of the very harsh conditions they're working in, are having serious mental health problems. And he's putting all this together, and so you get the amazing kind of Modern Times. You get The Great Dictator, and I do think that humor has such a role to play in how we navigate what we were talking about earlier. The fact that these stories can be very difficult, they can be bleak. Humor, creativity, joy, I think, is an underrated attribute of a lot of environmental movements.
And you're speaking my language. You're taking me back to that, to all these existential philosophers that I read who really grapple with, these deep and profound and very threatening issues, but they do it with a sense of absurdity. And I think it's the only way to survive and to keep our heads up and to be able to engage on a topic and on a planet that, is both terrifying and absurd, and is hilarious and is hopeful and is also, I don't know, just very, very real. And I'm so appreciative. I think that's a big reason why I wanted to chat with you today, is that very often these themes that are so universal find themselves excavated across many different fields of inquiry. And sometimes it's implicit. And every so often I come across a piece of writing, an individual who excavates them in such an explicit way that it really resonates for me. And so I wanted to bring you on the show because that is what happened for me with this book. And I'm just really appreciative of your ability to cut through to that. I don't know if that made sense, what I
That
just
means a
said.
lot to me. I think
Okay.
that actually pins down better than I could articulate what really motivated me to write The Burning Earth.
I love it. And I'm so glad that you did write it. And I'm so glad that you not only have the opportunity to share it with your students, but to broaden that classroom for those who don't have the opportunity and don't have the privilege of like going onto the Yale campus and signing up for your class, that everyone now has the opportunity to read these ideas and to grapple with them personally and with their immediate friends and families and colleagues. So I just want to thank you for, the last 20 years of your life. It's helpful.
Thank you, Karen. It's been such a pleasure to talk to you. This has been wonderful.
You too. And everyone listening, thank you for coming back week after week. I'm really looking forward to the next time we all get together to talk nerdy.